You're listening to On the Way Home with your host, Michael Braithwaite.
Welcome, friends of On the Way Home. Thanks so much for tuning in this week. We have a fantastic guest. We're going to talk all about social housing, and our guest is from the great province of Manitoba. Before we get to the guest, I should tell you this podcast is brought to you by the good folks at Blue Door. Check us out at bluedoor.ca. We're doing some cool stuff. We have a Housing for All land trust we're setting up. We're doing some development work, and we talk about that today more and more. Blue Door is not the exception. Nonprofits that have traditionally not been developing housing are. We're doing that ourselves, can no longer rely just on the private market. So we're doing some cool stuff there. Of course, we have our construction social enterprise, other pieces, and we're willing to share. If you want a construct in your community, we don't want to run it, but we want to help you set it up and find some funds to do that. Reach out to us again, bluedoor.ca. Listen, if you have ideas around, you want to be a guest on the show, you're doing something cool, you have a big challenge you're stepping up to, you know of someone, you have feedback for us on the show, you want to link us to someone, reach out to me, michael.b@bluedoor.ca. Would love to hear from you. Would love to hear feedback too on the show. We're always looking for new guests. There's so many people in the space doing incredible work, rising to the challenges. And hey, it's international. So anywhere you are in the world, if you're doing some good stuff, that we'd love to hear from you and share that. And that's what this podcast is all about, talking about the challenges and sharing how we've risen to them. If you're a lived expert, someone who's living in it or has lived in it, or you are a researcher or someone in the sector doing great work, reach out to me, michael.b@bluedoor.ca. Let's get to today's guest. I am so lucky to have Professor Shauna MacKinnon with me today, who's the chair of the Department of Urban and Inner City Studies at the University of Winnipeg. And she's very passionate, has lived experience, talks about it on the pod. We talk about her growing up in poverty and kind of, that being kind of the root of her passion to do this work. She's a founding member of the National Social Housing and Human Rights Coalition. So we talk about that work. We talk about her journey into this work. We talk about how the Social Housing and Human Rights Coalition came along and why. We talk about what is social housing, right? There's also, we talk about affordable housing and community housing. What is social housing? We talk about that, and we talk about the need, what it's defined as. We talk about the National Housing Strategy, the good, the bad, what it hasn't delivered, how much of it, has it done a lot for social housing? Spoiler alert, the answer is no. We talk about the new housing minister, who is, just said outright that he would like to really focus on social housing. And, could there be, with the funds that have already been allocated to this, could we shift some of those funds in the next month or so, in the short time we have before our next election, to social housing to really make a dent? She really hopes that could happen. We talk about thoughts on a different government coming in right now, heavily leaning. It looks like we'll have a conservative government led by Pierre Poilievre coming in. What does that mean for the sector in social housing? And we talk about her hopes for the future. It is a fantastic conversation centered around social housing, the need for it, and the work that is being done. We also touch on what's happening in Manitoba as well. We don't often have guests from our kind of middle provinces, and it's really cool to talk about some of the things that are the same and some of the things that are different. It's a great podcast. Let's go to that conversation now. Shauna, so excited to have you here today. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Great. Thanks to be glad to be here.
So we asked all our guests the staple first question, and it's personal to everyone who comes on the show, I believe, and who's passionate about this, and that is, what does home mean to you?
Yeah. So for me, home is sort of the foundation of everything, and it's sort of that sort of safe place to go to that you can enjoy with family and friends, and sort of that escape from sort of all the stresses of the day.
Very good. I love it. Succinct and there. And as per usual, you're not talking about four walls and a roof. You're talking about the feeling it gives you. You have such a cool background. I'm hoping you could just walk us through some of your journey, how you landed in the work you're doing now.
Yeah, for sure. So so I'm currently a professor at the University of Winnipeg in urban inner city studies, but my story is really one more of I come from a background of activism, and I guess I grew up in poverty and actually lived in social housing as a teenager. So I've always been fairly passionate about poverty issues, and I came to focus my activism and my research on housing and specifically social housing because I see it as such a foundation to everything else in terms of, access to education and, all the things that I talked about when I talked about what home means. And it concerns me that we've moved away from providing non-market social housing. And in many ways, we've come to the narrative around social housing is negative as sort of a not a good place to be. And so I've just been really passionate about trying to change the narrative and understanding about what social housing is.
Yeah, it's so true, right? When people, oh, that's social housing, right? And that's not said like, oh, that's social housing. I mean, it's not. And we need to change that because social housing is just housing. And we'll talk about the definition of that.
Yeah.
Just for people who might not be familiar, Manitoba's done some great work. And then even provincially, there's been some good announcements around encampments, et cetera. Can you paint for listeners just a little bit of a picture of what you're seeing in the province around homelessness and unhoused?
Yeah. So, well, I mean, we've got the same issues that that other cities are experiencing. So we have a significant issue around homelessness and encampments, and we've been through our Right to Housing Coalition here in Manitoba, which is where the Social Housing Human Rights Coalition really kind of got its legs. We've been really pushing the province for many years around expanding the supply of social housing. So recently, our new government has been better than the previous conservative government around these issues, and they recently released a homelessness strategy. But to be honest, we're not quite as excited as people might think about it because we're a little bit worried, as is always the case, that there's too heavy of a reliance on private sector housing. They talk a lot about the Houston model, which we have been very critical of because for that reason, it relies heavily on private sector housing and subsidizing the private sector. And so, yeah, the provincial government is investing in social housing, not enough. So we continue to push them to do better in that regard.
Yeah, work is far from done. Talk to me a little bit. You just mentioned it's the Social Housing and Human Rights Coalition. What is it, and why was it formed?
Yeah. So the Social Housing Human Rights Coalition is a national coalition, and we started the coalition about 3 years ago. And it was really because here in Manitoba, we've long been doing this advocacy, very focused on social housing. We started to do that here back in 2005 because we know there's all sorts of need for all kinds of housing, and so people are advocating broadly for housing of all kinds. We talk about affordable housing, and that definition is not particularly meaningful to us. So we wanted to really focus specifically on a specific kind of housing that we think is needed the most for people who are living in low incomes. And we noticed that at the national level, there wasn't really a focus. And so there's some great work being done at the national level for sure, but there wasn't any entity that was solely focused on calling on the federal government to expand what they were doing specifically to create more social housing. So we started actually with, I was able to get a social housing and social sciences humanities research council grant, and we brought a bunch of people together here in Winnipeg where we really started the conversation about how we could do this work. And from there, we launched the Social Housing and Human Rights campaign. And so we've been kind of busy at it since then.
Yeah, and I know I'm familiar with the grant you mentioned. That is a tough grant to get. So congratulations on getting that and doing this. And so people understand too, social housing has been around for many, many years. But if I'm correct, I mean, underfunded, of course, right? Where government up until kind of late 80s, early 90s, were investing every year in a lot of social housing or maybe other types, but social housing stopped and kind of took that and said, hey, provinces, municipalities, the downloading began and it stopped, and hence homelessness, right?
Yeah.
went way up. So it's the need to return. So you mentioned before, there's different types, or people talk affordable housing. Well, what does that mean? Well, CMHC has a definition, but that's not affordable to most or others, and not to pick on them, but there's community housing, there's co-op housing. When you talk social housing, what do you mean?
Yeah, so we say social housing because a lot of people will focus on community housing, which social housing includes community housing. So social housing is essentially housing that's outside of the market, and it's subsidized to rent at 30% or less of income. So people who are renting there are paying less than 30% of their income on rent. It's non-market housing. It can include public housing, and then it can include non-for-profit owned housing. It can include co-op housing. The key thing is that it's non-market housing.
And it's that threshold, right? I mean, I think I've seen some of the stats across the country where they say 30% of household income should be on housing and housing costs, right? Not just your, and I mean, in the GTA, some people are spending, 90%, 100%. And when we look at food bank usage, with the food bank does an annual, so Daily Bread in North York Harvest do it, Who's Hungry report, they look at, and percentage of people using the food bank have, I think, $5 or $6 left over after paying for housing costs. So that's got to be 99% of their wage. So 30%, we're a long way off. Do you agree?
Oh, absolutely. And yeah, for sure, it's going to be worse where you are. But, here in Winnipeg as well, people are, all too often paying far more. And, we have the same issues with people essentially using all they have to pay for their rent and, ending up to, get the food at the food bank. So, yeah, it's a real problem. And none of us are really benefiting from this because, well, a few people are benefiting from this in terms of those folks who are in the private sector able to get the rents, collect the crazy amounts of rent that people are having to pay. But when you think about it, people could be doing all sorts of things with that money in the local community that contributes to the economy, and we're just missing out on that. So it's really a problem.
Yeah, we've had Ricardo Trabajan on, and he talked about the rental wage, right? And he's talked about and I saw a graph, I think he put it out too, where it showed in the 1990s, if you received social assistance, you were actually able to afford a one bedroom apartment. And then if you look at that same now, because I mean, that's really flatlined social assistance across the country,
Yes.
mainly, and hasn't gone up, where rents have gone up significantly. So that gap is just huge
Yeah,
now. No longer is it even close, right?
yeah,
So hence the need for social housing.
absolutely. And I mean, the issue with social housing too is, as you said, I mean, the investment in social housing has just continuously declined. And then, so what's happening with social housing, and especially public housing, is that there's less of it, and so it's being used for the most destitute, which is further creating stigma uh, 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 for public housing, and so that's a real problem too. And so if you look at what social housing looks like in other countries, it's a broad idea that it's non-market housing and it's actually available for people, not just low income people, but people who are moderate income people. So I mean that's ultimately where we would like to see us go here in Canada, that we have this large supply of housing that's outside of the market and it's affordable for everybody, and so that you're not stigmatizing social housing as something that's that people don't want to live in but they're forced to.
Yeah, yeah, and also, yeah, this you're so right with the stigma. I remember years ago, and I've told this story before, where when my kids were young, and the principal said to me, "Why don't you take them to the breakfast program?" I'm like, "Well, no, no, we don't need it. I don't want to take away from people in need." And she said, "No, no, you don't understand. If only the kids that are in need go, it becomes the poor kids program and the stigma around it. If everyone's going, it's just a breakfast program." And I thought that was, yeah, it was brilliant and correct. And let me tell you, I was thrilled too, because they liked it far more than the breakfast I was doing at home. Um, but yeah, it's right. Like, you need a mix. We think mixed income in those communities. Now, in 2015, Liberal Party came in, so we're going to change this a bit. In 2017, 2019, kind of throughout the years, launch the first national housing strategy when they came into office. In your mind, this is, it was big, and the first kind of national taking responsibility for it. Has it made a difference in regards to social housing?
No, unfortunately. The initial intentions, people were, really happy to see the national housing strategy, and certainly the narrative was really around. The focus was on to address housing need for those housing for those most in need. So it really did suggest that this was the direction that we could be going in, and that's just not what's happened. So the majority of housing created through the national housing strategy has been market housing. For in terms of low, like housing for low income people, so rent geared to income housing, it's really just the smallest program of the national housing strategy, the Rapid Housing Initiative, that really guarantees housing created for rent geared to income housing. And that actually wasn't initially in the national housing strategy. That just came out during the pandemic. So all of the other programs are really focused on private. There's some nonprofit, but it's not rent geared to income. There are some, like 80% of medium market, which is good too. We need that housing as well. But when you speak specifically about social housing, really very little. It's less than 4% that's actually gone to social housing.
Yeah, and I remember that. I mean, if you ask people what the national housing strategy, they'll say the only thing, and I guess you pointed out, that's really created that has been the rapid, right? Where that wasn't happening before, because especially with changing interest rates, people couldn't really take advantage, build social housing with the types of programs that were available. It just was unaffordable to do so. Now we have a new housing minister,
Yeah,
Nate Erskine Smith, and he is our, God, I think since they came in. But we started. Who did we start with? We started with Jean Declos, right? Jean Declos, and then we went with Ahmed Hussein,
right.
and then Sean Fraser for a short time, and now we've got Nate. So this is our fourth, and likely, his reign will be short. He's a great guy. I know Nate has some great ideas. What do you think could be done? We think there's going to be an election called in the next, at least like somewhere in March, and then to take place, who knows, May,
Yeah,
June, in the next few months. What do you think could be done in this brief period of time with all the other priorities that the
yeah.
government's attending to, like tariffs, et cetera?
Right. Yeah. So yeah, whole bunch of issues and short time. So I was very excited when I heard the new minister talk about his interest in social housing and how he would like to, in his short time, do something to add to the social housing stock. So that's fantastic. Recognizing there's not a lot of time left, what we've been proposing, actually, we're just sending a letter from our campaign to the minister this week. And basically, what we're saying is the money that's budgeted this year, we understand like this is, it's we're in a difficult situation in a short timeline, but we would like to see the money that was budgeted this year for through the national housing strategy to be reallocated specifically used for social housing. And so, we feel that it's in the budget. We feel that this should be something that could be done, even though we've got prorogation that shouldn't affect it. They should be able to go to Treasury Board and reallocate its money that's already budgeted and just get that out the door and work with the provinces who will work with you. And so at that end, here in Manitoba, for example, we're pushing our provincial government in the same way. We're saying you need to approach the new minister who's keen on social housing and say you're ready to partner with them to make this, to redirect these funds specifically to social housing. The province could be providing the rent subsidies, which is something that's needed in addition to the capital. So we think that if there's a will, there's a way, and there's a will. So we need the provincial governments and the feds to work quickly, the ones that are willing.
And you're talking about these are the dollars already allocated. You're not
Yeah,
asking for new money.
exactly.
Um, Great, great. Well, listen, I mean, let's be realistic. I think if you look at the polls right now, unless there's some kind of massive shift, we are looking at a change in government. And for many people, I think in the sector, many people who listen to this podcast, there's a little bit of trepidation and fear, right? Like, okay, listen, we had a government that, certainly hasn't done enough, but did some things, the National Housing Strategy, rapid housing, acceleration funds, that type of thing, the right to housing. But, what do you expect, this new government to focus on, and what impacts will this approach have for low income renter households that we're trying to support?
So we're not hopeful. I mean, I completely agree with you. Like, we really would have liked to have seen a lot more done, but it's been far better than we've seen in a while. So some we certainly recognize that. But yeah, I mean, we're not very hopeful. The Polyev is not really shown any interest in this type of housing. In fact, more of a disdain for any kind of social investment in housing. So we think that it's gonna be a challenge to get any housing at all, the kind of housing that we're talking about. Um, yeah. So I mean, we'll just keep pushing. That's all we can do. I think it's also going to be really hard for provincial governments because they need the federal money to be able to do anything in this regard. Those partnerships are essential, and I think it's really going to be difficult for us even to advocate at the provincial level with the absence of funding at the federal level. And we certainly experienced that during the Harper years when there was very little for this type of housing as well. So I wish I could be more hopeful, but no, I'm not.
No, and I hear what you're saying. I think that's the trepidation across the board. We're not holding water currently, and if you do less, you know, we're going to be that much further behind where we can't be. Where we've talked about having to need 5 million homes across the country by 2030, and provinces are not meeting their housing stats. I think Alberta is one of the only provinces really hitting their housing numbers,
Mm.
and the cities like Edmonton, but Ontario is far behind. And so it's going to be a tough haul. I mean, there is the thought, right? Polyev and the Conservatives talked about supply, but if we're talking about what you and I talked about today, it's not the type of supply that we're hoping for, right? There's always a thought of, and we saw this when Ontario did this. They had this kind of blue ribbon task force that looked at. They called it the Affordable Housing Task Force, and it really should have been the Housing Supply Task Force, right? Because affordable wasn't really what it was all about. And the thought was like, if we hit this certain supply and we have more housing available, eventually cost of housing comes down and makes it more that kind of trickle down,
Yeah,
which most experts were like, well, that's just not going to get us to the need where,
yeah,
right?
yeah. That's not working for sure. It's not getting to the level. I mean, it might work at some level in terms of median market or a little bit below, but for people who are in low income situations, there's nothing available. I mean, here, I mean, and I know it's like this in other cities as well. There's virtually nothing available in the private market that's in decent condition for people living below the poverty line. It's non-existent. We've got a 1.7% vacancy rate here, but when you look at the supply for people in low income, it drops well below 1%.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we've at Balludor right now, where I work, across York Region, Durham, Peel, kind of northern GTA. We've got into the development business because we couldn't depend on the private market.
Yeah.
And it just wasn't going to happen. I mean, when you've got clients that may not have worked for a long time, don't have 6 months rent up front, don't have they may not have a stellar credit report competing with. And again, it's a business for many. It's not a competition anymore, right? So we've got to develop, and so interesting because so many nonprofits now are stepping into development, and it's not really our comfort zone. It's not what we've known, but we need the nonprofit sector to step up, as you said, versus the private to take this on. And we need some help and partnerships
Mhm.
along the way. What are your hopes as you continue? You've been hard at work at this. You're passionate about it. You're taking some of that personal experience and, kind of just diving right in. What are your hopes for the future? What would you like to see?
Well, I guess my first hope is that if we do end up with a Polyev government, it doesn't last more than one term, so that might help us. But I mean, again, as I said, like, in a perfect world, we would have a expansion of social housing. It would, it wouldn't be stigmatized. People would understand the importance of non-market housing as part of a healthy supply of housing. So I would hope for that, but that's sort of the dream. But in the near future, I think what we're doing is we're just trying to do the public education, right? And just try to get more people to see the value, so that when we do have elections, people will be more vocal about calling on people during elections to be, advocating for this, or to be making a commitment to this type of housing. And so I think really that's all we can do. Like we again, I say we've been doing this for a really long time here in Manitoba, and now recently the past few years nationally. And it's just the slow building of people who understand what we're talking about, so that then we can, build the advocacy at election time for social housing. So that's what we're going to be doing at election time. Again, calling on candidates to tell us what their plans are to develop the type of housing that we know that we need to address the housing crisis for the lowest income Canadians.
Now I know of examples, right, like Finland, and other places around the world that have done social housing well, right, created enough time, and remained focused on it through changing governments, not without a lot of working really hard, a lot of political will. In Canada, areas where you could point to and say this like a great example of where we've done this fairly well.
Yeah, well, that's a really good question, because it is really hard to find. And what tends to happen is we see, oh, they seem to be doing more here. And then when you talk to folks who are, in places like BC, seem to be doing more, but I mean, they've got such issues there as well. But they seem to have at least been able to take advantage of the National Housing Strategy to build some more of a supply of non-market housing there. I mean, obviously not anywhere nearly enough. I mean, I don't know how you're feeling about what's going on there, but I mean, we were all hopeful with your mayor seemed to be interested in more social housing or community housing. So I don't know what that looks like there. I don't like to sort of prejudge, what people think about how things are going in their communities, but
listen, it's a slow build, right? Slow burn. And I like, so at BC, we've had them on to talk about it. They had the housing acquisition fund, right? Which was amazing. Yeah. So then groups like my group or Social Kid BC Housing and others could apply, and they were getting stuff done. That was taken, and with help from the Canadian Housing Renewal Association and others, as, hey, we're going to do this nationally, and we've got a template from the province. But with the change in government, it's been a really hard takeoff. How we're going to roll that out. So still to see, and we need funds like that. Listen, you're doing incredible work, and we're grateful. Thank you for sticking with it through the tough times, and tough times maybe ahead. If people want to find out more about your work, what's happening, and get in contact with you, how can they do that?
Yeah, so we have a website. It's More Social Housing, basically. Just go to that, and we've got our campaigns, and you can become a member, and there's no cost. And you can join our campaigns and learn more about social housing and why it's something that we should be all advocating for.
Yes, social housing is a good thing, folks. I mean, this is not that thing, to live in social housing. And the mayor of Toronto, Olivia Chow, and her late husband, Jack, both lived in co-op housing, and they paid full. So it was a mix of social housing, right? And they say, we paid full rent, but it was a beautiful kind of situation to be a part of that, right? And so it's a great example of what we can do across this country. Shauna, thank you so much for the work you do. Thanks for your time today. We so appreciate it, and wishing you all the best as we move forward in this housing journey.
You're listening to On the Way Home with your host, Michael Braithwaite.